Greetings Pilgrims, I'm Doug, this is Camino 2020, a section of my channel dedicated to the Camino de Santiago in Spain and my preparations for going there in 2020. In this video I want to talk to you about St. James himself. The history surrounding the St. James of Santiago fame is rather difficult, and it's made difficult because we simply have a lot of different traditions going on regarding this particular apostle. Part of the difficulty is that biblical and traditional authors just didn't always provide as much detail as we might like concerning certain people's names, lives, history, dates, etc. That's just the way they did things back then. And so, for example, in the New Testament, we have a number of women named Mary, and they're not always designated with a family name or a relational name that lets us pinpoint exactly which Mary is being spoken of. And that is also the case with James. There are a number of Jameses in the New Testament, and in almost every case they're described in different ways, and so it's not always easy to figure out who is who. Most biblical scholars limit the number of Jameses in the New Testament to 3. James the Greater, James the Lesser, and James the Just. Some scholars actually put James the Just and James the Lesser together as a single person. Now, the Greater and the Lesser, either because of age or height, but certainly not because of importance. The James who was Bishop of Jerusalem and who wrote the book of James in the New Testament do not seem to be St. James the Greater, and that's the person we're talking about right now. St. James the Greater was one of the sons of Zebedee, one of the sons of thunder, along with the Apostle John. Along with Peter, John and James made up the kind of inner circle of the apostles. These 3 disciples were the closest to Jesus Christ during his ministry. They were the only ones to witness the transfiguration. They were the only ones there with him during his suffering in Gethsemane, and they are typically listed together. Now, Jesus was crucified in either AD 30 or 33, and after that he appeared to the apostles and told them to go out to Jerusalem, Samaria, and the ends of the earth with the gospel message. Those of you familiar with the Camino might note that that sounds somewhat familiar if you know a bit of Latin. And finish, or finis, fin in Latin, and terra, like terra firma for earth. Put them together, what do you get? Finisterra. Finisterra, the beach that many people often go all the way to during their Camino, was considered kind of the end of the Western world in the time of Christ, because the world back then was essentially the Roman Empire. Those two terms were synonymous. Now, we do not read in the book of Acts that anybody actually went to Spain. But there is strong tradition that says that St. Paul, eventually freed from one of his Roman imprisonments, made it to Spain. However, the Spanish area is a very big area, and it is highly unlikely that in the amount of time St. Paul would have had, that he could have really made the rounds throughout the whole country. A lesser tradition that is more contested is that it was actually St. James the Greater who made it all the way into northern Spain, and that he was really responsible for the beginning of the gospel there. Now, I need to make a disclaimer at this point. Practically everything that I am about to say is contested in one way or another by believing scholars, skeptical scholars, the church itself, and other various historians. There are a lot of stories surrounding St. James the Greater, and I have kind of collected the ones that seem to be repeated the most often into the tale that I'm about to tell you, but just keep in mind that virtually no point of this story is certain history. So, the way many of the stories go is that St. James the Greater went all the way up into northern Spain, and he started making some disciples to the Christian faith, but not very many years later he had a vision of the Virgin Mary. Now, she was still alive at this time, so whether this is considered a strict apparition, like Our Lady of Lourdes or Fatima, or whether this was like a bilocation where she was miraculously in 2 places at the same time, I don't know. But there was a vision to St. James of the Virgin Mary telling him to return to Jerusalem. When Mary appeared, she was said to be standing on a pillar of jasper, and this statue was given to build a chapel in present-day Zaragoza, or Caesar Augusta, and the present church that you see here is from the 17th century. And so he brought some of his disciples with him and did as she said, and in around 36 or 40 AD, depending on which version you read, he returned to Jerusalem. Now at this time, Christianity had just begun to spread. It was a relatively young faith, but it was converting many of the Jewish people in that area. And Herod Agrippa I, the king who oversaw that area for the Romans, did not like the trouble that the Christians were stirring up in his area. And so he began a series of persecutions against the Christians. Now enter St. James. As a son of thunder, he probably did not come into Jerusalem quietly. He probably made quite a stir. Some people say he converted a prominent Jewish magician, and this caused a bunch of trouble, civil unrest, etc. But whatever happened, Herod condemned him to die. And the chosen manner of death was going to be beheading. Now, one tradition says that St. James' reaction to this news was so pious and impressive that Herod himself converted to Christianity and ended up being beheaded with him. But whatever the case, St. James was beheaded in about AD 44, and that's recorded in the book of Acts. He thus became the first apostle of Christ to be martyred, and the only one recorded in the New Testament. Now, a pretty standard practice at the time was that those who were executed under the Roman government were not given a decent burial. And so, if family members or friends didn't take care of the body themselves, it was probably just going to be burned or thrown into a mass grave. Once again, tradition asserts that James's body was actually put on a ship that sailed to Spain. Now, whether it was done by the disciples that he brought with him, or by angels, or just by the providence of God, this ship containing the remains of St. James made it all the way back to the Iberian Peninsula, northern Spain. Now, this is where some interesting tradition develops regarding the famous Camino shell. And I've heard numerous stories related to St. James and the shell. One of them is that the ship basically crashed offshore and his casket was miraculously carried to the beach, and when it came on land it was covered in these shells. Another one is that the ship was off the coast during a wedding on the beach, and the horse that the bride was sitting upon got spooked, ran into the waves, and they both would have drowned, except that they were both miraculously saved, again covered in seashells. The third version of the story that I have heard is that on a cliff above a beach, there was a knight on horseback. The horse came off the cliff into the sea, and the knight and the horse were both miraculously saved, again covered in these seashells. That area became very strongly united to the idea of the seashell, and eventually, when pilgrims started making their way to the tomb of St. James, they would bring back a shell to kind of prove they had been there. It was sort of like a badge of the pilgrim. Well, how did that happen? For that, we need to fast forward nearly 800 years. Although St. James had been buried in northern Spain, the tomb had been forgotten. About 813, 814 AD, it was discovered by a monk named Pelayo. And there are various stories of how he discovered this tomb. Some of them just say he came upon it and it had an inscription that he couldn't read, and so he had to go to the bishop, brought him out, they read the inscription and discovered, lo and behold, this is the tomb of St. James. The more fantastic version of the story, though, and one that makes more sense with the eventual history of the Camino, is that this monk was led to the tomb of St. James by some miraculous activity in the stars. So that when he came to the field where the tomb was laid, he named it the Field of Stars. In Latin, campus for field, like a school campus, and stellae, where we get stellar, for stars. Campus stellae, compa stella. So, St. James' tomb is rediscovered. Bishop Theodomir alerts King Alphonsus II up in his court at Oviedo that these relics have been found. And so the king travels down from Oviedo to the Compostela and makes the very first pilgrimage of Santiago. And that is why this route is known as the Primitivo. It is the first pilgrimage to the relics of St. James. Now, the next big piece of this history is St. James Matamoros, the Moor Slayer.
I'm so sorry, it's the Moops.
Now, to back up a little bit, by about 711 AD, Muslim invaders had pushed their way all the way up into northern Spain, and most of the Christians had fled to that area of Galicia in order to escape the persecution that the Muslims brought. Somewhere around 834 or 844, depending on which source you read, we have the Battle of Klaviyo. And at this battle, it is said that St. James himself appeared on a white horse with a banner and began routing the Muslims himself to take Spain back for Christianity and the Western world. And that is why many times St. James is pictured not only with the pilgrim hat because of his pilgrimage to Jerusalem and becoming the patron saint of pilgrims, but he is also considered the patron saint of Spain because it was this battle that became kind of the idealistic symbol of the West and Christianity pushing the Muslim invaders back out of Spain and retaking the country. In the 12th century, Pope Calixtus II wrote a series of books, or collected a series of books, known as the Liber Sancti Jacobi, and in these books he discusses liturgy and some of the historical moments that took place during the life of St. James. And in the 5th book, he gives the first kind of travel guide to pilgrims. By this point, making that particular pilgrimage had become so popular that it was rivaling pilgrimages to Rome and Jerusalem. So the Camino de Santiago was born. So that is the basic story of St. James the Greater, patron saint of pilgrims, patron saint of Spain, and the reason for the Camino de Santiago. Now, you might be wondering, I can see where Compostela came from. I know Camino means the way, but where did Santiago come from? Well, it's not too difficult to guess that Sant means saint, but how in the world did Iago come from James? Or how did James come from Iago? For that, we have to look at a little bit of language history. In Hebrew, the name Jacob comes from Yaakov, and something like this enters into the Greek language as Jacob, Jacobi. And then, as Latin kind of took over as the most current language of the church, it became something more like Iacomus. But in the 14th century, when John Wycliffe made a Bible translation into English, he translated Jacobus as James, and future English translations did the same. It's not that far off from Iago in Spanish. I hope this video has been helpful to you. If it has, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Click that bell notification and you will get updates as any more videos drop. I'm Doug. Thank you for being here. This is Camino 2020. Buen Camino.